Paige's text came in while I was standing in the kitchen, my hands still damp from the sink. The screen lit up just as the house settled into its usual evening quiet. Just one line. "I need you to see this." No explanation. It was the kind of message Paige sent when she wanted me to stop everything and pay attention. I opened it, and my heart stalled. The photo appeared, sharp enough that I could almost see the soft, warm glow reflecting off the wine glasses in front of them. Bennett, my husband, sitting in business class, next to a woman I'd never seen before. They weren't touching. There was nothing that counted as suspiciously intimate. But Bennett's eyes tilted toward her, and she was smiling. The kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in a long time. Not sweet, just warm. Warm in a way that tightened my chest. I zoomed in. A mistake. But I did it anyway. Bennett's fingers were close enough to the woman's that with the smallest movement, they would have touched. That distance wasn't an accident. It didn't feel like it, at least. It was the kind of almost touch that sinks a wife's heart, yet stays just far enough apart that no outsider could say anything for sure. That feeling was somehow more suffocating than catching something unmistakable. I sat down at the dining table, the chair giving a small creak, and looked at the photo again. One frozen moment, enough to pull my mind back to the past few weeks. Or maybe it had been months, and I just pretended not to notice. Bennett and I weren't the kind of couple who fought. We didn't throw words at each other, and we didn't have long, simmering arguments. And the distance between us showed up in a quieter way, a kind of space that widened day by day, so light it was almost invisible, until one day you look up and realize you're standing on opposite sides of the same house. I remember the quiet dinners, where the sound of a fork hitting a plate was louder than our voices. I asked him about work, and he answered with short lines that made everything sound fine. He asked about my day, but his eyes always stayed on his phone longer than they stayed on me. Some nights he came home late. The reasons sounded perfectly reasonable. The apologies were light as air, leaving no trace. And I learned to smile and say, "It's okay." A habit I can't even remember when I started. I set my phone down and closed my eyes for a second. In my mind, I saw Paige, with that familiar, sharp look of hers. She always saw through whatever shell I tried to put up. She wasn't someone who talked much, but every time she spoke, her words were like thin blades. Not cruel, just accurate enough to hurt. Paige is the kind of person who can spot danger from a mile away. And if it involves family, especially me, she won't wait for me to figure anything out. She'll point straight at it, sometimes without caring whether I'm ready to hear it. I once told her there were things I wanted to understand on my own. Paige once said, "You tend to wait until it blows up in your face." The photo was still there on my screen, and I couldn't shake the thought that this time, maybe Paige had decided she wouldn't let me ignore a single sign anymore. I looked closely at Bennett in the picture. The tilt of his eyes, the small smile, and the way his body angled slightly toward the woman. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. People sit next to strangers on planes all the time. People make small talk. People smile. But what tightened my throat wasn't what they were doing. It was the familiarity of it. Because there was a time when Bennett used to look at me like that. I set the phone down again and leaned back in the chair. The house was still quiet. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock. I realized I hadn't heard Bennett laugh in this house for a long time. Paige didn't text anything else. She didn't need to. One photo was enough. I let out a long breath, the kind that makes your chest feel hollow. Not crying, not sharp pain, just the exhaustion of someone who's seen something for a while, but never dared to name it. I looked at the picture one last time and told myself, maybe I knew this was coming. Part of me believed Bennett was hiding something. Another part felt like something in that photo didn't quite fit him, like it wasn't telling the whole story. There were still too many blurred edges to decide who was right or wrong, but one thing was clear. Nothing was going to be the same anymore. The moment I told myself maybe I knew this was coming was still hanging in the air as I walked toward the sink. Water had filled the pan, and the dishwasher hummed behind me, a steady background noise. The whole kitchen glowed under the dim yellow light I'd never noticed was this lonely. I set my phone on the counter, but a few seconds later I picked it up again to look at the photo one more time. No matter how I looked at it, the space between Bennett's hand and the woman's felt like a small blade, not striking, but sharp enough to slice through the thin piece we'd been holding onto for too long. Bennett wasn't home at this hour. Lately, that wasn't anything new. He'd left a short message before heading out. "I've got a few things to take care of." The content was always the same, only the tone shifted a little. Nothing specific, nothing long. And when he came back, he'd usually set his bag down and say, "Took longer than I thought," as if that explained everything. I leaned against the counter. Our life had become like that, functional enough, but missing any real pulse. He'd asked to postpone dinners with friends, skip the small anniversary date I'd planned a week ahead. Once, I made his favorite meal, but when he walked through the door, his face was so tense I couldn't even start a conversation. After a few times like that, I stopped trying to plan anything. It felt like we'd slipped off each other's schedules without either of us admitting it. I reopened Paige's message. No explanation. No asking how I felt. That was exactly her style. Sharp, but never wasting a word. I took a breath and hit call. Paige picked up instantly. Her voice was steady, unhurried, as if what she sent was just another task in her day. "You saw it?" "Of course I saw it," I said. "Do you know who that woman is?" There was a small pause on her end, a faint clink like metal touching metal. She was probably in the galley on the plane. Then she answered, "I don't know her name, but I saw enough not to trust him." The sentence hung in my kitchen like smoke that wouldn't clear. What do you mean, enough not to trust him?" Paige didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, one of her strategies. Sometimes it forces you to face what you've been avoiding. "He doesn't look at you like that," she said at last. "I just wanted you to see it." I had to grip the edge of the counter for a second. Her words weren't an accusation, but they cracked open something that had already been fragile for a long time. I thought back to the moments from these past months, the times I told Bennett about work, and he only murmured a vague response before changing the subject. He didn't ask for details anymore. His eyes didn't hold the same interest. Nothing was blatantly wrong, but his repeated detachment settled over us like a thin layer of dust. I remembered a weekend we were supposed to spend at Lakeview. His idea, actually. Bennett had been excited, even bought me a light jacket because it gets windy up there. But 2 days before the trip, he said something urgent came up at work and we'd have to cancel. He hugged me and said he was sorry, but the embrace felt empty. I couldn't point to what exactly had changed. I just knew something was gone. And what unsettled me most was this. There was no proof Bennett was cheating. No strange messages. No unfamiliar perfume. No guilty, evasive behavior. Just a growing coldness, like a house slowly losing heat because someone opened the door on a winter day and never closed it. "That photo could be misunderstood," I said, though even to my own ears it sounded weak. Paige answered, steady as stone. "I didn't send it for you to judge him. I sent it so you'd stay awake." The way she said it made me feel like I'd been living in a dim room for so long, I'd forgotten what real light looked like. I sat at the table. My fingers brushed the edge of the phone, as if it might somehow offer clarity. Paige spoke again, her voice lower. "Do you ever feel like you're living by yourself?" The question froze my hand. I didn't answer right away. Paige didn't push. She never rushed me when she knew I was standing at the edge of something I'd been avoiding. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Based on the way you've been talking about Bennett lately," Paige said, "it doesn't sound like someone talking about their partner anymore. It sounds like you're trying to hold on to a shadow." A simple line, but enough for me to feel a crack run through my chest. You think I'm worrying about something that isn't real? I asked. No, she said immediately. I think you're afraid to name something that is real. My throat warmed, not from anger, but because Paige had touched exactly the place I kept avoiding. The possibility that I'd lived too long in a state between holding on and letting go without the courage to admit it. I looked at the photo again. Bennett tilting his head, the woman smiling, the space between their hands hinting at something, though it could mean nothing at all. The problem was, I no longer knew what was real and what I was imagining. And worse, I no longer knew what Bennett felt anymore. Paige spoke again, her voice lower. I'm not saying Bennett is a bad guy, but you have to ask yourself, are you happy in the way you deserve to be? There was a slight pause, like she was deciding how far to go. Then she said the final line. I saw more than I'm telling you. I lifted my head. What did you see? Paige went quiet for a moment, then said, You'll understand later. When the call ended, I stood alone in the kitchen, the dishwasher still humming behind me. But now that sound only seemed to underline the emptiness between Bennett and me. And for the first time, faint as it was, I felt this might not be only about Bennett. There was something in the way Paige spoke, like she was steering the story, not just reporting it. A thin suspicion, light as smoke, began to spread, quiet but persistent. What did Paige know, and why wasn't she telling me? That night, when Bennett came home, I realized I was looking at him differently. Not in a way that tracked every move, but the way someone notices a door that's been there all along yet never opened. I wanted to ask him about the flight, about the woman in the photo, about everything. But when I heard the lock click, I stayed still. You're still up? Bennett asked, setting his keys on the table. I nodded. Yeah, I have something I want to ask. But he gave me that thin smile, the tired one he'd worn so often lately. Can it wait until tomorrow? I'm pretty wiped out. A simple sentence, but it made me feel like I'd been pushed outside his circle of priorities one more time. I stayed quiet. And maybe that silence was the start of the chain of moments that made me believe something was wrong with Bennett, even if I didn't know what the real problem was. The next morning, when I asked, Did you sleep okay? He just said, Yeah, and poured himself coffee. He didn't ask me anything in return. I asked, Are you busy today? All he gave was a vague, the kind of sound that carried no meaning. He avoided my eyes the entire morning. When I asked about a stack of documents on the table, he barely glanced at them and said, Nothing important. I couldn't understand why he couldn't answer normally like he used to. His silence grew so thick it felt like I was trying to dig out a secret I wasn't even sure existed. Then there was a moment that chilled me. I walked into the living room and asked, What do you want for dinner tonight? Bennett was hunched over his papers. Without looking up, he answered immediately, Dana, send me the report next week, okay? I froze. Dana wasn't my name. And it was the name of an old client, someone he'd worked with months ago. And he had just called me that without thinking. He realized it half a second later. His face went pale. Sorry. I mixed things up. My mind's all over the place. I didn't get angry, but something inside me sank. Not because it sounded like a sign of cheating, but because it showed his mind was somewhere I didn't belong. That afternoon, a call came in while we were both in the living room. The screen showed only a number, no name, but the moment he saw it, his expression changed. I asked, Who is it? He declined the call and answered faster than he ever did. Just work. A simple line that could have meant nothing, but the way he ended the call, quick, sharp, like he was cutting off a rope pulling him somewhere, made my chest tighten. That night, I stood outside his office door. It was slightly open, and I heard him let out a long breath, the kind that sounded like he was trying to lift his whole body out of something heavy. I'd never heard him sigh like that before. It wasn't the sound of someone annoyed. It was the sound of someone wrestling with something they didn't want to name. When I gently pushed the door, Bennett turned around. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual, like he was searching for the right words. But then he just let out another breath, softer this time, and turned back to his screen. Do you need something? Not cold, but empty. I didn't step inside. I just looked at him for a few more seconds and said quietly, no, nothing. I closed the door. It felt like I just stood next to a wall I never realized had been built. In that night when he was getting ready for bed, I said without thinking, you seem able to share things with the whole world, except your own wife. He paused. No strong reaction, no explanation, just a slightly longer blink before he lay down on the bed. I'm just tired, he said, but that sentence didn't mean anything to me anymore. The next morning, I called Paige. I hadn't planned to tell her everything, but the words came out easier than I expected. Paige listened, never interrupting. Then she said, I forgot to tell you, that day he and that woman talked for quite a while, not the usual small talk. I felt my heartbeat pick up. Did you hear anything? I asked. Paige let out a very soft breath. Not clearly. It was loud, but I saw them connect. I went quiet. Something in the way she said it made me shiver. Paige spoke like she was piecing together an entire picture from empty spaces. But the strange thing was, she never gave details. Just half lines, enough to push me forward, but never enough to confirm anything. I asked again, more directly this time. Are you sure? I mean, if they talked for a while, it could have just been polite. It could, she said, but you have to look at the whole picture, not the individual pieces. The whole picture, she meant, the one I was seeing, was made of scattered behaviors that didn't quite add up to a single conclusion. There was no clear proof Bennett had someone else. Just withdrawal, exhaustion, distance, and Paige somehow kept dropping each piece of information at exactly the right moment to make it impossible for me not to doubt. After the call, I sat on the bed trying to string everything together. Bennett dodged questions. He accidentally called me by another woman's name. He hung up the phone like he'd been caught. He looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. But all of that could just be signs of a man drowning in stress or in a life he didn't know how to explain to his wife. The problem was, I didn't know. And Paige didn't seem to want me to understand it in any direction except the one she was steering me toward. In the evening, when I talked about a few small things from my day, Bennett just nodded without asking anything else. His eyes looked tired, distant, and I felt a truth even more painful than suspecting betrayal. I didn't know anything about my husband's feelings, and that lack of understanding made every small action of his feel like potential evidence of anything, right or wrong. While I was washing my hands, my phone buzzed. A message from Paige. Did you ask him yet? I replied, not yet. She immediately sent another line. Don't let it go any further, you know that. I didn't understand why that sentence made my spine go cold. It wasn't a threat, but it felt like she was controlling the rhythm of my breathing. And for the first time, I noticed something strange. Paige was asking about my relationship more than usual. She asked with a kind of unusual urgency, like she was waiting for me to answer in a certain direction. And every time I sounded suspicious of Bennett, her voice softened, like it relieved her. I set my phone down, either feeling a thin line of tension run from the back of my neck down my spine. I couldn't tell if it was fear or if something had just been exposed. I was starting to see a truth I'd never even considered. Maybe Bennett wasn't the only one who had something off. And if someone was leading me into a story, that person might not be Bennett. It might be Paige. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I knew I couldn't drag this uncertainty out for one more day. It wasn't anger pushing me. or even hurt. It was a kind of exhaustion so deep that even breathing felt heavy. When Bennett came downstairs, his hair still damp from the shower, I was already waiting at the table. On the table, the photo lay in the center, a cold reminder that it was time to talk. He saw it before he saw me, and I caught the flicker of surprise on his face, quick but unmistakable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, neither raised nor shaking. He pulled out a chair and sat. "About what?" I turned the phone toward him. "About this." There was no loud scraping of a chair, no objects falling, just a silence that thickened between us. "If you have something you want to say," I continued, keeping my eyes on him, "say it. I'm tired of guessing." Bennett leaned back. He didn't look at the photo anymore. He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I could hear the heater running in the corner of the kitchen. Finally, he said, "I'm not cheating." A simple sentence, not dramatic, but it felt like the whole room dropped a degree. Not because I believed him right away, but because his voice didn't carry the defensiveness guilty people usually have. It sounded more like he was releasing a weight than protecting himself. His fingers brushed the edge of the photo. "This woman, her name is Marcy." I didn't react. I stayed quiet so he would continue. "She's a single mom in the crisis support group I go to. Her husband passed away 2 months ago. That flight was the first one she had to take alone since everything happened." I felt my hands tighten together under the table. "She sat next to me by chance," Bennett said. "I didn't arrange anything. And we talked because she couldn't stop crying." In that moment, the image of the woman in the photo, the soft smile, the slightly bright eyes, shifted completely in my mind. And it was no longer a hint of intimacy. It looked more like a brief moment of relief after days of exhaustion. "I didn't tell you because—" Bennett paused, searching for the words. "I was afraid you'd think I was trying to blame life to explain why I've been distant. Or worse, that you'd worry." I leaned back in my chair. A space opened inside me. Not because I felt relieved, but because I realized there were parts of Bennett I'd never known. Not because he hid them, but because I'd stopped asking a long time ago. "I'm not cheating," he repeated, "but I know I haven't really been here." That sentence made my chest tighten in the quietest way. I didn't say anything. I stood up, grabbed my phone, and walked away from the table. Not because I wanted to avoid him, but because there was another question I needed answered right now. I called Paige as I stepped into the backyard. The cold wind numbed my cheeks, but I needed the space. She picked up after 2 rings. "What's going on?" she asked. "You sent me that photo," I said directly. "But why only that moment? Why didn't you tell me the whole context?" Paige went silent. A different kind of silence from before, less like she was guiding me, more like she was weighing something heavier than a quick explanation. "Why, Paige?" I repeated. "Finally," she said, her voice lower than usual, "because I think you've lived too long in a loose marriage." I gripped my phone tighter. "You've been carrying loneliness without saying a word," Paige continued, "and I've waited a long time for you to see it yourself. But you keep living like nothing's wrong." I didn't know what to say. Not angry, not shocked. Just felt like someone had pulled the curtain down at the exact moment it needed to fall. "I used that photo," Paige said slowly, "to force you to look at what you've been avoiding. You're not happy. And I'm afraid you'll lose yourself if you keep going like this." The cold wind slipped under the eaves, but Paige's words were colder. Not cold to hurt. Cold like a scalpel. Precise, necessary, and painful with purpose. "You should have told me the truth," I said, my voice low but steady. "Would you have listened?" Paige asked. There was no answer. She knew, and I knew she knew. Paige went on. "He's not cheating on you, but he's also not there for you anymore. And I needed you to understand that, not with logic. Fine, but with feeling. Another truth surfaced as I heard that line. Paige wasn't trying to destroy my marriage. She was trying to break the numbness I'd wrapped around myself. She was trying to wake something in me that had slept too long, the part that knew I deserved to be cared for. When I stayed quiet too long, Paige added, "If you're angry, I'll take it, but I won't apologize for wanting you to open your eyes." I rested my hand on the railing. The cold seeped into my skin. "No," I said, "I'm not angry." And it was true, because I knew too, if Paige hadn't done this, I probably would have kept drifting through each day pretending everything was fine, even though I hadn't felt fine in a long time. When I walked back into the house, Bennett was still sitting at the table. He didn't ask who I'd been talking to, and he didn't try to explain anything else. He just looked at me, a look I hadn't seen from him in months, the look of someone who finally understood he had a part in the breaking, not in a guilty way, but in a responsible one. The three of us, me, Bennett, and Paige, were all facing the same bare truth. No one cheated on anyone, but we had all let the distance become the third person in this marriage. And Bennett, with that quiet look, let me know he finally saw what I had been facing alone for so long. The next morning, I woke early even though I hadn't slept much. Light slipped through the curtains in thin lines across the floor, and for the first time in months, I felt myself standing at a turning point. Not an ending, not a new beginning, just a crossroads I couldn't avoid anymore. Bennett came downstairs. He stood at the doorway for a few seconds like he was choosing how to start the conversation. I spoke first. "I think we should live apart for a while." No raised voice, no shaking, just the truth. Bennett looked at me, longer than he ever had before. Not hurt, not angry, just a quiet acceptance. "I don't want a divorce," I continued, "and I don't think we should break up, but I think we need space to breathe again, to learn how to exist without forcing ourselves into the role of husband and wife." He pulled out a chair and sat down, his hands clasped together. "I understand." That simple sentence made me release a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for so long. "I don't want to lose you," Bennett said, "but I also know I've let things go too far." I nodded slightly. "This distance isn't to walk away. It's to heal." And for the first time in months, we agreed not out of obligation, but because we finally saw the same truth. The first week living apart was stranger than I expected. The small apartment I rented temporarily was so quiet, I had to turn on music just to feel alive. No sound of Bennett opening the door, no familiar footsteps, no heavy silence hanging between us. Just me, and the space I needed to face. I signed up for a pottery class I talked about for 2 years, but never actually took. I reconnected with a few old friends, the ones who always asked, "How have you been?" And I used to answer with vague lines, even I didn't believe. Now I was learning to answer honestly. I also went to therapy, not to fix the marriage, but to find myself again, the version of me that wasn't trapped by fear of change. Some nights, when I sat shaping clay and it refused to take form, I realized my marriage was the same, not ruined, but needing to be reshaped. And I had to accept that sometimes you have to take something apart so the rest can stand. Bennett, during that time, also started therapy. He didn't say much about it, just sent one text. "I don't know why I let myself grow so far from you, but I'm trying to find the answer." A short message, but enough for me to know he was working on himself. We still talked, but not out of obligation anymore. Not the polite, required exchanges. Just two people trying to learn how to walk again on new ground. One night, Bennett came by to return the jacket I'd left in his car. He stood at the door, hands in his pockets like he was afraid to get too close. We talked for a few minutes, about work. About how he was trying to run again, about my pottery class. Then, right before he left, he said, "If we still choose each other after this space, it'll be a choice, not a duty." A simple sentence, but it cut straight through the worry I'd been carrying for so long. I didn't answer. I just nodded, and he understood. I met Paige a week later, after she'd finished a long flight. She looked tired, but her eyes were still as sharp as ever. We sat in a small diner where she always ordered the same thing every time she came home. Paige stirred her water, not looking at me as she said, "I know you're mad at me." "I'm not mad," I replied. She looked up. "I'm sorry for how I handled it. It was extreme." I leaned back in my chair. "You forced me to look at the truth I kept avoiding. That's not betrayal." Paige let out a breath, and for the first time in years, I saw something lighter in her. Not defensive, just relieved. "I just didn't want you to turn yourself into a shadow in your own life." I gave a small smile. "I get it now." In that moment, I realized Paige's place in the story wasn't to divide anything. It was to cut the rope I had tied around myself out of habit. The way she did it wasn't delicate, but I knew the root of it wasn't destruction. It was protection. When she left to catch her next flight, I watched her go and thought, some people love us in loud, obvious ways, and some people, like Paige, love in a cold, sharp way that sometimes hurts, but always leaves us stronger. Now, I'm living in my small apartment. Bennett is in the old house. We meet once a week, not to fix anything, but to talk like two people learning how to look at each other again from the beginning. We don't make plans. We don't make promises. We don't pressure ourselves to come back together or to walk away. We just stand a little steadier than we did a few months ago. I'm learning to listen to myself before I listen to anyone else. Bennett is learning to say the things he's been hiding, even when it's hard. The future isn't clear, but for the first time, I don't need it to be clear. I just need it to be honest. The ending of this story isn't leaving. It isn't returning either. It's simply a door that's open, waiting for us to choose it when we're truly ready. And if I learned anything from all of this, it's that sometimes distance doesn't break a marriage. It saves it. What do you think? Can a marriage be saved by the truth? Or are there times when distance is what saves both people?